Hello, and welcome to SBTI's training for financial institutions, Module 4, on Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 operational emissions. In this module, we'll be diving into how to develop science-based targets for Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 operational emissions. At this point, you should be familiar with what science-based targets are, as well as the 3 different types of emissions they measure, as well as why it's important to set science-based targets to combat climate change. After completing this module, you'll be able to choose an appropriate baseline year, boundaries and accounting methods, calculate current and target emissions, access and use relevant tools. Let's get started. As discussed in Module 3, emissions are classified into direct, Scope 1, and indirect emissions, Scope 2 and 3. Scope 3 can be further divided into those originating from the company's operations, categories 1 through 14, and those originating from financed emissions, category 15, which you see in the bright blue. In this module and the 3 that follow, we'll explore how to set targets for each of these categories of emissions. Because Scope 3 financed emissions are so much larger for financial institutions, we will spend more time on how to calculate Scope 3 financed. This module will focus on Scope 1, 2, and 3 operational emissions, which you see in gray in the top half of your screen. As we discussed in Module 3, there are 3 steps for developing targets: set boundaries, calculate baseline, and then calculate the target. We will cover all 3 steps in this module for Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 operational emissions. To start, you'll want to pick a base year. Before we begin, though, I want to orient you to the tickers that you see on the top left and the top right of the slides. We include these on all slides throughout Modules 4, 5, 6, and 7, so you know what stage of the process you're in, which is on the left-hand side in purple, and what scope of emissions this is about, which you see on the right-hand side in gray and blue. So let's talk about selecting the base year. SBTI recommends using the most recent year for which data is available. However, it is up to you as the organization to select the year that best represents a good baseline for emissions. GHGP recommends using the earliest year with reliable data, and PCAF defers to GHGP and SBTI when selecting a base year. Reminder that we overviewed the relationship between these 3 organizations in Module 2. It's also important to be consistent. Whichever year you pick, it'll be important to use the same base and target years for all your targets with the midterm and long-term timeframes. This will make it easier for individuals and teams across your organization to align and communicate progress towards achieving your targets. While it is important to set a base year early on, you'll need to iterate to find the right year as you assess Scope 1, 2, and 3. As you select a base year, there are some challenges and considerations to keep in mind. As you are starting out, you may have limited data, quality, and availability. Significant structural changes like mergers or acquisitions can make it challenging to pick a base year. Varying time periods for loans or investments can affect how you account for emissions, leading some companies to choose an average over many years rather than a single year. Balancing achievability and climate impact, as well as financial impact and client engagement, is another consideration. These are common challenges and will require trade-offs, but can be addressed. To determine what falls into Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions, you must select a single consolidation approach that is applied consistently across the institution. This will simplify reporting and target setting. There are 2 broad categories of consolidation approaches: the control approach and the equity approach. Within the control approaches, there are 2 different methods: the operational and the control approach and the financial control approach. Operational control, which you see on the left-hand side, is defined as the authority to introduce and implement operating policies. A firm using the operational control approach will account for 100% of the emissions for which they control and implement operations of the organization. This is more commonly seen in organizations like private equity firms, where they are buying full control of a company and directly influencing operations. The other control approach for consideration is financial control. This is defined as the ability to influence financial and operational activities. Oftentimes, this is determined based on voting rights or influence, not necessarily direct operating control. Economic substance is the important criteria here in determining what to account for as emissions. Companies using the financial control approach will account for 100% of controlled Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. The other consolidation approach is the equity share method. This is more common for companies with complex owner-operator agreements. It determines emissions based on the percentage of equity a company has in a particular operation or entity. In other words, if a company owned 9% of another company, you'd account for 9% of that company's scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Given the nature of financial institutions and their investments, SBTI recommends and PCAF requires the use of the control approach, whether operational or financial. This allows financial institutions to account for almost all of their investments as scope 3 emissions rather than scope 1 or 2. The only exception would be when an investment is large enough to result in significant financial or operational control, which is rare. Using a control approach simplifies reporting and more accurately reflects emissions from financial activities. Once you've determined your organizational boundaries, you'll want to identify your operational boundaries to classify emissions as scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 operational and finance. Under SBTI's different scopes require different coverages. Scope 1 and 2 require the baseline, cover 95% of emission sources across the institution. Scope 3 operational does not currently require targets and is optional. Scope 3 finance is required under SBTI. Coverage requirements vary based on asset class and can be as low as 67%, but for many asset classes, 100% coverage is required. Due to the differences in data available for different scopes, different accounting is required for the various greenhouse gases released. Scope 1 and 2 require that all 7 major greenhouse gases be covered by the targets. For Scope 3 finance, CO2 must be included at a minimum, but you can include other greenhouse gases. When reporting, PCAF allows CO2 equivalents to be used and provides a method for converting other greenhouse gases to the equivalent CO2 impact. Reminder, if you've gone through Module 2, Voluntary Finance Climate Action Ecosystem, you'll have seen the slide breaking down the questions of how SBTI does and doesn't relate to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Partnership for Carbon Accounting and Financials, PCAF. For the real economy, GHGP covers emissions for all scopes. However, for financial institutions, GHGP covers Scope 1, 2, and Scope 3 operational emissions, while PCAF covers how to account for Scope 3 financed emissions. PCAF and GHGP tightly partnered, and PCAF has the mark of assurance from GHGP. How does this relate to SBTI? SBTI is built upon and refers to the GHGP standards. For Scope 3, it incorporates the PCAF methodology, but FIs can set SBTs without PCAF. SBT follows PCAF closely, only differing significantly in one spot, but that could change over time. Throughout all the modules, we will call out where SBTI relies on and/or differs from GHGP and PCAF. For PCAF in particular, there's a deeper dive in Module 5, Scope 3 Emissions Overview. We've now moved on from setting our boundaries to calculating the baseline. Calculating baseline emissions sets the foundation for the targets you will set. There are 5 steps to calculating a baseline. You can use the Greenhouse Gas Protocol guidance for Scope 1, 2, and 3 operational, and PCAF guidance for Scope 3 finance when setting a baseline, with some exceptions provided by SBTI, as you'll see in Module 5. Step 1, identify emission sources. This is also sometimes called creating the greenhouse gas inventory. The goal here is to create a catalog of all the major sources in Scope 1, 2, and 3, where your company contributes greenhouse gas emissions. The most common ones for the banks are, in Scope 1, mobile combustion emissions, in Scope 2, purchased electricity, heat, or steam, and for Scope 3, Category 15, financed emissions. Step 2, select the approach. Next, you'll need to select an approach for calculating the amount of emissions released per source. Scope 1 and 2 are normally fairly simple. Fuel use data is normally sufficient for financial institutions Scope 1. We'll explain more about Scope 2 approaches on the next slide, but you can select either a market-based or a location-based approach. Scope 3 is more challenging and will cover methods for calculating emissions in modules 5 and 6. Step 3, collect the data. Once you've determined an approach, you will need to invest the time and resources to collect the data. This can be time-consuming, especially for Scope 3 emissions, as will be discussed in more depth in modules 5, 6. Once you've gathered the data, the GHG protocol provides a number of tools to calculate your baseline emissions. The links provided in the deck will bring to cross-sector and sector-specific tools to calculate greenhouse gas emissions. And finally, step 5, consolidate data to the corporate level. Once you've gathered the data and calculated the emissions, you'll want to consolidate the information at the corporate level. This can be done in one of two ways, either centralized, whereby the raw data will be reported to a central corporate group to then calculate emissions, or a decentralized approach can be used. In the decentralized approach, facilities will gather their own data and calculate emission metrics on their own and then report the metrics to the corporate. Either is acceptable, but you'll want to be thoughtful about choosing who reports what to whom. Diving deeper on step 2 for calculating the baseline, SBTI requires that companies select one of two approaches to calculate scope 2 emissions baseline, and then separate guidance for how to calculate the target itself. Under the market-based approach, emissions are counted for based on the specific energy contract the company uses to buy electricity. That means a company can contract with suppliers using renewable or low emission power generation activities to reduce their scope 2 emissions. Under the location-based approach, emissions are accounted for using the average energy generation emission for the defined geographic region. This approach is designed to reflect the impact that a company has on the overall grid. Because in some markets, there is limited supply of renewable or low emissions technology, even if a company purchases their electricity from a low emissions source, it may still impact the overall grid, as it might mean that higher emission sources are used to generate the electricity needed for other users on the grid. In addition to choosing a calculation approach, companies also have a choice in selecting the target. Companies can either select an absolute reduction target, reducing the total overall emissions from the electricity they purchase, or a renewable procurement target, acquiring 80% of their electricity from renewable sources by 2025 and 100% by 2030. It should be noted that the renewable procurement target is only a near-term horizon target. If you're setting both near and long-term goals, you will need to set an absolute reduction target for long-term goals. Scope 3 operational emissions, reflecting categories 1 through 14 of the 15 categories defined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, are operational under SBTI. They're operational emissions and they're optional under SBTI. Since each of the 14 are unique items with unique metrics and ways of calculating, the best source of how to baseline is to refer to the GHG technical guidance for calculating Scope 3 emissions found on GHGP's website. SBTI requires that targets be set in the near to midterm horizon. You'll want to make sure your near-term targets meet the following criteria. This is guidance for Scope 1, 2, and Scope 3 operational. Reminder that Module 5 overviews Scope 3 financed emissions. Your base and target years. Your near-term targets must cover 5 to 15 years from the date of submission. Tracking progress. You cannot submit targets for accomplishments you've already achieved. When setting your targets, you'll want to consider where your organization is and where reasonable ambition can take you. Level of ambition. All scopes for financial institutions must be aligned with a well below 2-degree pathway at a minimum. As of July 15, 2022, all non-financial institutions, so corporates, must have Scope 1 and 2, and they must have targets aligned to a 1.5-degree pathway. Measurement methods. Scope 1 and 2 targets must use either the absolute method or the intensity method for setting targets. Diving in more deeply on the method for calculating the target, Scope 1 and 2 allow for 3 different methods: absolute contraction, physical intensity, and economic intensity. For each of these methods, you'll want to understand the measurement method, consideration, and how it'll affect your minimum annual reduction. Going across from left to right, absolute contraction focuses on reducing the absolute amount of carbon within a scope. This can be very impactful as it directly ties to the goal of reducing the amount of carbon released into the atmosphere. Targets for absolute contraction would look like reducing carbon emissions for Scope 1 by 30% by a particular date, for example. Physical and economic intensity look at reducing carbon emissions per a specific unit of activity, either a physical or an economic unit. Intensity goals help to focus your organization on improving the efficiency of specific operations. Physical intensity measures a reduction per physical unit, like kilowatt hours. Economic intensity focuses on a reduction per economic unit, like reducing emissions per dollar of revenue. In selecting a method, you want to think about a few considerations. Absolute contraction may seem harder to achieve, but it is easier to communicate and links easily into the SBTI target setting tool. Physical intensity has two calculation options, commercial buildings and absolute and physical unit. These may be more or less practical depending on your existing business model. Economic intensity is tied to financial drivers, and you'll want to consider how this ties to your business. All the methods will require a 4.2% reduction from the base starting in 2020 to achieve the 1.5 degree pathway or well below 2 pathway. If the baseline is later, then the linear reduction will be steeper. While all these approaches are allowed, SBTI strongly encourages absolute contraction for financial institutions, especially given the relative size of their scope 1 and 2 emissions. To have a substantial impact, ambitious goals are needed, and absolute contraction allows for transparent and ambitious goal setting. To help illustrate what goals could look like for each of the methods we just discussed, we've included a few examples of companies who have already set scope 1 and 2 targets. La Banque Postale employed an absolute contraction approach, committing to reducing their scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions by 46% by 2030 from a 2019 base year. Property developer, owner, and operator Swire Properties use physical intensity, given the nature of their business, and committed to reducing scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions by 35% per square meter by 2025. Finally, Kering, a luxury goods retailer, committed to reducing scope 1, 2, and 3 operational emissions by 50% of unit value by 2025. To make it easier to calculate how to reach the 1.5 target, or well below 2 if you're a financial institution, SBTI has created a tool. You can use the tool to help you calculate scope 1, 2, and 3 operational reduction pathways. To use the tool, first you will input the target setting method you're using, absolute contraction or SDA for scope 1 and 2, absolute or intensity for scope 3 operational. Next, you will input the base year. As mentioned, SBTI recommends using the most recent year for which data is available. Then you will enter in the emissions information. The required emissions information and measurement inputs will vary based on the method selected. And finally, you will review the emissions target provided by the tool. There are a few important things to note as you're setting your targets. For example, it's important to remember for setting any of your scope targets that offsets and avoided emissions are not allowed. Offsets are the removal of emissions made in order to compensate for other emissions. SBTI requires the reduction to come from the organization's own carbon emissions, not by offsetting it from other organizations. Similarly, avoided emissions or emissions that were avoided because of a project or product cannot be counted. Concluding this module, you should leave with a few key takeaways. Setting boundaries and calculating baselines are frequently challenging steps for financial institutions in the target setting process and take more time than expected. Scope 1 and 2 targets must cover a 5 to 15-year goal and align with a well below 2 degrees pathway for financial institutions and should be calculated using the absolute contraction method. SBTI provides an Excel-based tool to calculate the target pathway. Thank you for listening to this module.